There is a concept in my language Velsharath which translates, poorly, as the moment a soldier accepts the math of dying. Every species I have encountered has this concept. Different words. Same understanding. You calculate the odds. You accept the outcome. You stop fighting the inevitable and begin managing the delay. I served 31 cycles as a tactical observer for the Kethlon Combined Expeditionary Force. I have watched the Drethvi fight until their nerve clusters burned out. I have watched the Salvani send their entire upper caste into a collapsing trench because the strategy required it. I have stood on 17 battlefields on 11 different worlds and I have seen, without exception, every species reach that moment. The calculation. The acceptance. The math of dying. I want to be precise about something before I tell you what happened on Vareth 9, because precision matters to me. It is, I will admit, something of a professional illness. I kept logs. Meticulous ones. I have reviewed them many times since. There is no entry in my logs where the human did the math. I checked. I went back through everything. I was thorough. I am always thorough. There is no entry. I don't think they know how. This is the account of third engagement, Vareth 9. Coalition forces versus the Arath Dominion's 7th Reclamation Army. My name is Sev Oreth, and I was the senior observer attached to a human unit called the 14th Breach. I had filed a report predicting our annihilation within 4 rotations. The humans thought that was funny. I did not understand why, at the time. I do now. I almost wish I didn't. The forward observer post had been a building, once. Now it was 3 walls and a smell. I was crouched behind the intact wall, the only one still load-bearing, which I had calculated was unlikely to remain so for more than another 9 or 10 minutes given the rate of incoming fire recording into my field log, because recording into my field log is what I do when everything else has stopped being something I can control. It is, my former unit commander once told me, both my greatest professional asset and a significant personality defect. I agreed with him on both counts. Rotation 14, 3rd hour. Coalition forward post Delta 9 has sustained critical structural damage. Arath Dominion Artillery Heavy Siege Class, range approximately 4.2 kethlengths, is maintaining suppression fire at 12-second intervals. Current personnel count, 1 Kethlon Tactical Observer, designation Sev Oreth, for humans, designation 14th Breach Forward Element. 1 human is wounded. 1 human appears to be eating, I looked up from the log. The human who appeared to be eating was, in fact, eating. She had produced a small metal container from somewhere inside her armor, which I want to note had also stopped 2 Arath fragmentation rounds in the last hour, which should have rendered the human inside it a medical statistic, and she was eating its contents with a small tool while incoming fire continued to redesign the building around us. Her name was Vasquez. Corporal. I had been assigned to her unit 6 days prior. I had filed 3 separate reports in those 6 days predicting outcomes that had not occurred. "You're staring again," she said, without looking up from the container. "I am observing," I said. "It is my designation." "Sure." She turned the container slightly, examining the remaining contents. "You want some?" I looked at the container. I looked at the ongoing artillery strike. I looked back at the container. "What is it?" I asked, because I am thorough even when thoroughness serves no tactical purpose. "Nutrient paste." "Technically. The label says it's supposed to taste like something called chile. I've never had actual chile, so I can't confirm." She shrugged, a gesture I had catalogued but still found anatomically improbable given the weight of her armor plating. "It tastes like rust and someone's attempt at optimism." She offered it to me again. I declined. I returned to my log. 1 human is eating. Rust-flavored optimism. I do not have a classification for this behavior. Filing under human *, the other 3 members of the forward element were Kowalski, Devi, and a man everyone called Scratch, whose actual designation I had never successfully obtained because every time I asked, someone nearby started shooting at us. Kowalski was the unit's technical specialist, which meant he spent most of his time convincing equipment to work in conditions its manufacturers had specifically warned against. He had a habit of talking to the equipment while he worked long, low conversations in what I eventually identified as a tone of negotiation rather than instruction. I had asked him about this once. He had said, "You get better results if you ask nicely." I had logged this under human, possible cognitive anomaly, low priority. I had been wrong about the low priority. Devi was the medic. She was currently treating the wounded human, a man named Park, from the adjacent unit who had reached our position 40 minutes ago carrying a Irath anti-personnel round lodged in his shoulder armor and wearing an expression I can only describe as personally affronted. Debbie worked on him with the focused efficiency of someone solving a moderately interesting puzzle, and Park made occasional commentary that I believe was intended to be humorous and which Debbie ignored with the practiced ease of long familiarity. Scratch was on the broken wall with a long-range targeting scope, watching the Irath artillery position, and saying nothing. Scratch, I had noted, said very little. He watched. He calculated. In this, we were similar. The difference was that his calculations never seemed to arrive at the same conclusions mine did. 2 guns, he said, after a long silence. Different crew rotation times. The left one resets in 8 seconds, the right one in 12. So, said Kowalski, from under a communications relay he was attempting to reassemble. So there's a 4-second window where neither of them is tracking. Silence. That's not enough time to do anything, I said, because it was not. 4 seconds. The distance between our position and the Irath line was approximately 800 keth spans. No entity could cross that distance in 4 seconds, and even if they could, there were 17 Irath infantry positions between us and the guns. I had counted them. I had also calculated the probability of successfully navigating all 17, and the result was a number I had not logged because writing it down had seemed gratuitously cruel. Scratch lowered the scope. He looked at me with the particular expression humans use when they are being patient with someone they find slightly exhausting. I wasn't saying we should do that, he said. Just noting it. Why note something that serves no tactical purpose? He thought about this. Habit, he said, and raised the scope again. I did not log this. I was not sure what category it belonged in. The building lost its fourth wall 11 minutes later, which was 2 minutes longer than I had projected. I noted this discrepancy without satisfaction. Being wrong in directions that keep you alive is still being wrong, and I maintain standards. We moved to a secondary position, a drainage channel that Vasquez had identified on approach as a potential fallback, which I had not noted in my own survey of the terrain, and which I found myself adding to my mental catalog of things Vasquez had noticed that I had not. The list was becoming substantial. The drainage channel smelled extraordinarily bad. I noted this with all 7 of my olfactory receptors, which is the sensory equivalent of being told the same piece of bad news by 7 different people simultaneously. It's a sewer, said Debbie, cheerfully, helping Park into the channel with a practiced grip on his uninjured arm. Why are you cheerful about that? I asked. I'm not cheerful. This is just my face. She settled Park against the channel wall. Also, the Irath have terrible olfactory sensitivity. Better than ours but worse than yours, right? She looked at me. I confirmed this, reluctantly. So they won't use this route. Which means we have some time. She turned back to Park's shoulder. See? Tactical sewage. This is a good day. I opened my log. A human has described sewage as a tactical advantage and characterized it as a good day. I am in a sewer on a dying world, being suppressed by a Dominion army that outnumbers our position by a factor of approximately 40 to 1, and a human has called this a good day. I am going to try to find a reference point for this in the strategic literature. I do not believe I will find one. Park made a sound that might have been a laugh. Don't laugh, said Devi. I haven't finished. Yes ma'am, said Park, and made the sound again anyway. The Irath Dominion's 7th Reclamation Army had taken Vareth 9 in 60 days. This was fast, even by Dominion standards. Verith 9 was a contested industrial world, contested being a diplomatic term for both sides wanted badly enough to ruin it, and it had 17 coalition garrison units when the Dominion arrived, plus significant civilian infrastructure that was now significantly less significant. I had been sent to observe the coalition's counter-offensive capability. Specifically, to assess whether human combat units attached to the 14th breach could achieve meaningful disruption of Dominion supply lines before the main coalition fleet arrived in what Command estimated as 12 rotations. My assessment, filed on arrival, no. The units were undermanned, undersupplied, and, operating in terrain the Dominion had had 60 days to fortify. The most probable outcome was what the Kethlon military doctrine called Thelverith, the correct decision to spend a small loss to prevent a larger one. You sacrifice the forward units. You preserve the fleet. You accept the math. I had written this up in careful, precise language. I had submitted it through proper channels. Vasquez had been in the room when I submitted it, as she was my designated liaison. She had read it over my shoulder because humans apparently do not have a cultural concept of private documentation. She had said. I have been thorough, I said. Yeah. She had handed it back. You've been thorough about everything except what we're actually going to do. The report covers projected outcomes across 17, right? But, it doesn't cover what we're going to do. She had already turned away. Come on. Kowalski wants to show you the relay situation. I had followed her, because she was my liaison and her unit was my observational assignment, not because I had any reason to believe Kowalski's relay situation would contradict my report. The relay situation was this: the Dominion's artillery network was coordinated through a central command relay positioned at what they believed was a safe distance behind their lines. Kowalski had spent 4 days in between being shot at and negotiating with malfunctioning equipment, quietly mapping the relay's signal architecture. He had done this by listening. They use a pretty standard encryption matrix, he said, showing me the signal analysis on a screen that had been repaired with what appeared to be adhesive and hope. But they ping every relay node every 40 seconds to confirm integrity. Which means you can map the network topology by tracking the ping intervals, I said, because I am a tactical observer and this much I could follow. Right. He looked pleased. And, once you have the topology, you know where the central node is. And, once you know where the central node is, it's still behind 17 fortified infantry positions, I said. Yeah. He agreed with this readily, which was not the response I expected. It is. He waited. So, I said. So we don't go through the 17 positions, said Vasquez, from the doorway. We go under them. She unrolled a terrain map on the table. It was annotated in her handwriting, small, aggressive, covering all available space, with elevation markers, Dominion patrol schedules she had apparently been tracking personally, and a route that went directly through the drainage infrastructure of what had once been Verith 9's northern industrial district. Through the sewers. I looked at the map for a long time. I ran the calculations. The route she was proposing would take them through terrain that no tactical survey had assessed because no tactical survey had considered it passable. It was not, by any reasonable metric, passable. The drainage tunnels had been damaged in the initial assault. Sections were flooded. Sections had collapsed. The Dominion hadn't fortified them because the Dominion, quite reasonably, had assessed that no functional military unit would use them. This requires moving through approximately 2.3 keth lengths of unstable subterranean infrastructure, I said. Yep. In the dark. We have lights. While carrying enough disruption charge to destroy a command relay. Kowalski's already packed it. She tapped the map. The Dominion's whole artillery network goes dark when that relay drops. 12 rotations until the fleet arrives. We just have to keep them from bombarding the landing zones for those 12 rotations. I looked at the route again. I ran the calculations again. The probability of successfully traversing this route and destroying the relay without casualties is I didn't ask about casualties, she said. This was not a sentence I had a category for. You did not ask about casualties. I asked about whether it's possible. She looked at me steadily. There was something in her eyes that I had started to notice more and more over 6 days, not recklessness, which I could have classified easily, but something more specific. Something patient. Is it possible? I ran the calculations a third time. Technically, I said. Good. She rolled up the map. We move at next dark cycle. I want to be precise about what happened in the 20 hours between that conversation and the moment we entered the drainage tunnels, because precision matters, and because some of it is still difficult for me to render in professional language. Park's injury was more serious than initially assessed. Devi spent 4 hours in surgical intervention. Park spent those 4 hours making commentary that I believe was intended to keep him self-conscious. At one point he asked me to tell him something interesting about Keflon biology, and I told him about our secondary circulatory system, and he said, "Wait, you have 2 hearts," and I said it was not precisely hearts, it was more accurately described as secondary hemolymphatic distribution nodes, and he said, "You have 2 hearts and you're going to stand there and tell me I have to stop complaining about a shoulder," and then Devi told him to stop talking and he stopped, but he was still smiling. He had a round in his shoulder. He was smiling. I logged this. I still don't have a good category for it. Kowalski finished packing the disruption charges and then spent an hour repairing the suit communications of every unit member unnecessarily, since the communications were technically functional, because, as he explained to the equipment, functional isn't good enough, we need good. He had conversations with each component. He apologized to a relay chip he had to replace. He told the detonator assembly that he trusted it. I had, at this point, logged 47 separate instances of humans extending social behavior to objects, non-sentient entities, and abstract concepts. I had initially classified these under cognitive anomaly. I was increasingly unsure this was the right classification. Vasquez sat alone for a while during the preparation period. Just sat. I observed this because it was my assignment to observe, and I noted that she was doing nothing in particular, not reviewing the plan, not sleeping, not engaging in the nutritional behaviors she normally used to fill silence. Just sitting. After a while she took something out of a pocket on her chest armor. A physical photograph, not a digital image, but a printed one, which is a technology my people abandoned several hundred cycles ago as redundant. She looked at it. She put it back. She stood up and started checking her gear. I did not ask about the photograph. I have thought about this since, whether I should have asked, whether it would have been appropriate, whether asking would have helped or hindered or simply been an intrusion into something that was not my business and, which was also, clearly, the business of whatever she carries with her into every terrible place she goes. I recorded, personal artifact, photograph, 1 instance. Duration of observation, approximately 4 minutes. Behavior following, gear check, mission preparation. Emotional state, unknown unknown. I was supposed to be an observer. The tunnels were everything the map had promised and several things it hadn't. The water came up to mid-thigh on the humans, which put it somewhat above my natural reach, requiring me to engage my secondary mobility configuration, a fact I would find embarrassing to record, except that Scratch, who was in front of me, moved through the same water as if he had been doing this for years, which for all I knew he had. I had not obtained Scratch's full service record. I had, in retrospect, not obtained many things I should have. The darkness was absolute except for the lights on their suits. Vasquez had given me a small thing, clipped to my recording apparatus, and I had noted that she had simply handed it to me, without discussion, without suggesting I might need it. She had just known I would need it and provided it. This kind of anticipation, the automatic extension of resources to a companion before the companion has articulated the need, I did not have a word for in Keflon. I was accumulating a significant list of things I did not have words for. Kowalski moved carefully. He placed his feet with extraordinary precision, testing each step before committing, and I noticed after a while that he was doing this not to protect himself but because the disruption charges on his back could not be jolted. He moved that slowly, that carefully, through flooded collapsing tunnels under an occupied world, because he was carrying something fragile. I thought about this a great deal. We were 40 minutes into the tunnels when the first collapse happened. It was not catastrophic. A section of ceiling gave way 30 keth spans ahead of us, dropping approximately 2 tons of fractured infrastructure into the route. Not catastrophic, but definitively impassable. The route Vasquez had mapped went through there. She stood in front of the collapse for a moment. Water moved around her boots, black and slow. "Okay," she said. That was all she said. She turned around, moved back to a junction we had passed 12 minutes earlier, and crouched over the map with Kowalski's light for a long moment. Then, she stood up. "There's a parallel line, 30 spans east. It branches off here." She indicated the junction. "Adds about 20 minutes, but it reconnects before the relay point." "You mapped alternatives?" I asked. "I mapped everything I could find," she said. "You always map everything you can find." This was stated as if it were obvious. As if it were simply what any competent person did. I had not mapped the alternatives. My survey had covered the primary route. I logged this without comment. The alternative route was narrower. Scratch went first and established that it was passable. Kowalski went second, moving with his same patient precision. Devi and Park walking under his own power, which remained a medical detail I was still processing, went third and fourth. Vasquez waited at the junction until I had entered the alternative route, then came in behind me. "Your analysis said we were going to die here," she said, conversationally, from behind me in the dark. "My analysis projected outcomes based on available tactical data," I said. "And the data said we were done. The probability distribution heavily favored." "How often are you right?" she asked. I thought about this honestly. "Most of the time," I said. "I am thorough. My projections are well supported." "And this time?" "I am currently revising in real time." I heard something in the dark that might have been a laugh. "What's funny?" I asked. "Nothing," she said. You remind me of someone." "Who?" A pause. "Water." The distant sound of something structural settling above us. "My dad," she said. "He counted everything. Had to know all the numbers before he'd do anything. Drove us crazy." Another pause. "He was usually right, too." I moved through the dark tunnel under an occupied world and said nothing, because I did not know what to say, and sometimes, I have found, nothing is the correct answer. We reached the relay position in 3 hours and 41 minutes. I will not detail the technical process of the disruption charge placement, because Kowalski handled it and it was, by his own description, fiddly, and the full account of what fiddly means as applied to demolitions work in a drainage corridor under heavy enemy infrastructure is something I have documented elsewhere. What I will note is that during the 24 minutes it took Kowalski to set the charges, the rest of us maintained a perimeter in a space barely large enough for the purpose, in total silence, while above us the Dominion's 7th Reclamation Army went about its business in complete ignorance. And, in that silence, waiting, I noticed something. Vasquez was watching Kowalski work. She was not monitoring the perimeter. Scratch and Devi had that covered. She was watching Kowalski specifically, and her expression was the one I had started to think of as her real face, the one under the operational efficiency, the one that appeared when she thought no one who would file a report was looking. It was not a complicated expression. She was worried about him. Not about the mission. Not about the charges or the relay or the 12 rotations until the fleet arrived. She was worried about him, this specific person with his habit of talking to equipment and his patient negotiation with recalcitrant machinery, crouching in a flooded tunnel doing something very dangerous with great care. And then, Kowalski said, quietly, to the detonator assembly, "You've got this. I believe in you." And Vasquez's face did something I did not have a word for. Not a smile. Smaller than that. More internal. The expression of someone who has watched this specific person do this specific thing before, and is tired, and is scared, and still finds it right. Correct. A thing that should exist in the universe. I looked away. I looked at the tunnel wall, which was concrete reinforced with alloy mesh, and I counted the mesh apertures in the section nearest to me. There were 43. I did not look back until Kowalski said done, and we began moving toward the exit route. The detonation was scheduled for the moment we cleared the tunnels. Scratch timed it. He did not say anything during the countdown, just held up fingers, counting down in the silent language that military units develop, the shorthand of people who have spent too long in places where noise is lethal. We came out of the tunnel into a ruined processing facility on the north edge of the industrial district. Night had come while we were underground. The sky over Vareth 9 was the color of a bruise, shot through with the light of ongoing bombardment from the eastern line, and I stood in the open air with water draining from my secondary configuration and tried to remember when I had last been somewhere quiet. How long? Vasquez asked Scratch. He held up 4 fingers. Then, 3. Then, 2. Then, the horizon ate itself. The relay detonation was not, technically, large. The disruption charges were targeted and precise. Kowalski's work, which I should have expected would be precise. But the cascade it triggered through the artillery network was something else entirely, because when a command relay fails, every gun it coordinates loses targeting coherence simultaneously, and the automated safety systems of the Dominion artillery pieces, designed to prevent friendly fire in exactly this kind of cascade failure, shut the entire network down. Every gun on the northern line went silent. Not just quiet. Silent. I have been in many combat situations. I have never heard that sound. The negative sound of a battlefield artillery network going offline. The silence where the bombardment had been. Vasquez stood in it for 3 seconds. Her head was slightly tilted, like she was listening to something specific. Then, she said to her comm unit, Coalition Command, "This is 14th Breach Forward Element at Grid November 7. Northern Artillery Network is down. Confirm window for landing zone establishment." A pause. A voice came back that I recognized as belonging to a staff officer I had met briefly on assignment intake, a Salvani named Ketvara who I had always found somewhat condescending about human combat capacity. The Salvani officer's voice, I noted, had changed somewhat. Confirmed, 14th Breach. 12 rotations to fleet arrival. You have your window. How did you sewer, said Vasquez. A longer pause. I copy that. She clicked off the comm and looked at me. You're doing the logging face, she said. I am always logging. What are you logging right now? I thought about what I was logging right now. The silence. The horizon. The way she was standing in the open air of a world she had just changed the outcome of, with water drying on her boots and nutrient paste somewhere in her armor that tasted like rust and optimism. I am revising my probability models, I said. She looked at me for a moment. Yeah, she said. That seems right. She turned away, toward where Kowalski was already starting to argue cheerfully with his communications relay. Somewhere behind us, Debbie was checking Park's shoulder with a light held in her teeth. Scratch was watching the eastern line, scope up, not talking, noting things. I stood there in the bruised night of Vareth 9 with my log open and no entry typed. And I thought about Velsharath, the rational acceptance of a correct loss, and how I had carried it with me like a tool, like the most reliable instrument in my professional kit, through 31 cycles and 17 battlefields. I thought about Vasquez asking whether it was possible and not asking about casualties. I thought about Kowalski apologizing to a relay chip. I thought about Park, smiling with a round in his shoulder. I thought about 43 mesh apertures in a tunnel wall, which I had counted so I would have something to count instead of looking at a face that made me feel like I was observing something I had no classification for. The eastern line was still active. The next 12 rotations would not be quiet. We were still outnumbered, still undersupplied, still operating in terrain the Dominion had had 60 days to fortify. Every variable that had produced my probability distribution was still true. And the relay was down. I opened a new log entry. Rotation 14, 7th hour. Northern Artillery Network destroyed. 14th Breach Forward Element, 5 personnel, 0 casualties. Coalition Command confirms landing window secured. Revising outcome projections, I paused. Note, previous projections failed to account for one variable. Variable resists standard classification. Recommend further observation, *. I closed the log. Kowalski had gotten the communications relay working. He thanked it. Behind me, very quietly in the bruised night, Vasquez started humming something. I did not recognize the song. I listened anyway. 3 rotations after the relay went dark, the Dominion sent the Reclamation Corps. I want to be precise about what this meant, because I am always precise, and because the word reclamation in Dominion military doctrine does not mean what it might suggest to an outside observer. It does not mean reclaiming territory. It means reclaiming the acceptable outcome. It means the Dominion looked at their failed artillery network, looked at their compromised northern line, looked at a 12-rotation window they could not afford, and decided to send the kind of unit that does not negotiate with terrain or probability. The Arath Reclamation Corps were not soldiers in any conventional classification. They were problem solvers. Specialists in making problems stop existing. They moved in a formation the Dominion called Vareth 7, which my tactical literature described as an adaptive encirclement protocol requiring no fixed fortification, which in practical terms meant they flowed around obstacles like water around stone and tightened until the obstacle was no longer an obstacle. I had read about them. I had never observed one in the field. I logged, *rotation 17, first hour. Confirmed Reclamation Corps activity, Northern Quadrant. Estimated unit strength, 3 full companies, approximately 400 personnel. Coalition forces in sector, 14th breach forward element, plus 6 additional survivors from adjacent units who reached our position in rotations 15 and 16. Total, 11 personnel, *. I did the calculation. I have done many calculations in my career. Some of them have been correct. I closed the log because writing the number felt, at that moment, like a cruelty I was not willing to commit to paper. Vasquez was looking at the same tactical data when I came to find her. "You've seen the numbers," I said. "Yeah." She was eating again, the last of the nutrient containers, I noticed. She ate without looking at the food, attention entirely on the map. "The Reclamation Corps, I know what the Corps is." "Then, you know what the projections, Sev." She looked up. She had started using my abbreviated designation about 2 days ago, without announcement, without asking whether this was appropriate. She had simply decided. "I know the projections." "You're very good at projections. Tell me something I can use instead." I opened my mouth. I closed it. She was not dismissing the data. She had the data. She was asking for something the data did not contain, which was a problem because I am a data-based observer and I had, in 6 days of operating with the 14th breach, not yet identified the category of thing she was always asking for. "Tell me about the core movement patterns," I said, because I am a tactical observer and this was something I could actually offer. She nodded. Ate a spoonful of rust-flavored optimism. Listened. The 6 survivors who had reached us in the previous 2 rotations were not, individually, in what any medical classification would describe as optimal condition. There was a Kethlon engineer named Vortessen who had lost 2 of his secondary limbs and was managing this with a pragmatism I found professionally respectable. There were 4 more humans, 3 from the 14th breach's secondary element and 1, a large man named Ferreira who spoke very little and moved like something that had been constructed for load-bearing, from a unit I had never encountered in my assignment brief. There was a Salvani signals specialist, young, who had been separated from her unit and arrived at our position in a state I can only describe as substantially disrupted. Her name was Vethanara. She was in her first deployment cycle. She had not encountered humans in the field before. I had also been in my first deployment cycle once. I tried to remember what that had been like, and found that I could not quite, because the deployments since had rearranged my memories into something less legible. Vasquez had given Vethanara coffee. I want to be specific about the coffee, because the coffee was its own phenomenon. The humans carried a compressed powder that, when combined with heated water, produced a dark liquid that smelled like something had been burning for a significant period of time and had accepted its fate. They consumed this regularly, at intervals that seemed tied more to psychological need than biological necessity. It was, by multiple accounts, disgusting. It was also, somehow, one of the things they seemed most committed to. Vasquez handed a container of it to Vethanara without ceremony, while the young Salvani sat against the wall in the way of someone whose situational processing had exceeded its throughput capacity. Vethanara looked at the container. "What is it?" she asked, which was the same question I had asked, and, I thought, she is going to receive the same non-answer I received, and it will be equally unsatisfying. "It'll help," said Vasquez, and walked away. Vethanara looked at me. "Will it help?" she asked. I thought about this honestly. "I don't know," I said. "She says it will." Vethanara looked at the container again. She drank. She made a sound that was not, precisely, positive. "Keep drinking," I advised, because this was what I had observed. She kept drinking. Something about her posture, over the next 10 minutes, changed in a way I could not clinically describe except to say that it became less like someone sitting against a wall and more like someone who was choosing to be there. I logged this under human beverage, psychological effects. Further observation warranted. If Ferreira, I eventually learned, was not from any unit I had encountered because he was technically not currently assigned to a unit at all. He had been separated from his deployment transport during the initial Dominion assault and had spent the subsequent 60 days operating alone in the Northern District, which was information so improbable that I spent several minutes checking whether I had heard it correctly before I accepted it as accurate. 60 days, I said. "Yeah," he said. "Alone. Mostly." He thought about it. "There was a dog for a while." "A dog," I said. "Yeah. Stray. Hung around for a few weeks." He paused. "Good dog. What happened to it?" He was quiet for a moment. "It left. Dogs do that." I had many follow-up questions about the nature of the dog and its relationship to military operations and how exactly one maintained combat readiness for 60 days alone in occupied territory, and I asked precisely none of them because Vasquez caught my eye across the room and made a small gesture that I had learned meant, "Not now." I did not ask. I logged, *human, 60 days solo operation in occupied zone, apparent psychological stability, unclear mechanism. Filed under, further observation, *. This was becoming my most common filing category. The Reclamation Corps moved at night. This was, I noted, tactically sound. The Corps had superior low-light sensory capability to most coalition species. They were trained for zero illumination movement. Darkness was their natural operational environment. What they had apparently not accounted for, what, according to my review of the tactical literature, no one had ever specifically had to account for, was operating against a unit that had a human who had spent 60 days alone in the same district they were now moving through. Ferreira knew this ground the way water knows a drainage channel. He spent 4 hours before the Corps' projected arrival time taking Vasquez and scratched through everything he knew: patrol patterns, blind spots, structural weaknesses, 3 locations where the ground was unstable in ways that did not show on any survey because they had become unstable over the previous 60 days through specific accumulated damage that Ferreira had been, without any formal assignment to do so, documenting. "This section," he said, pointing to a spot on the map that Vasquez's terrain survey had marked as solid, collapses under anything above about 400 kilograms. I tested it. "You tested it," said Scratch. "Needed to know." "How did you test it?" Ferreira considered this. "Dropped things on it," he said. Scratch looked at the map. He looked at Ferreira. He looked at the map again. "Okay," he said. I had stopped being surprised by things the humans described as self-evidently obvious methods of gaining critical tactical information. I had started instead trying to identify the moment in their reasoning where what seemed like recklessness resolved into something structured and intentional. I had not yet found that moment, the place where it stopped being one thing and became the other, but I had started to suspect that the transition did not exist. That they were the same thing. That the recklessness was the structure. This was a very uncomfortable thought and I was not yet ready to log it formally. When the Corps came, they came correctly. I want to give them credit for this, because I am precise and, credit is due, they moved exactly as the doctrine described. Adaptive encirclement, patient, no overextension, each element covering the advance of the next. They were, operationally, excellent. I watched them on the sensor feeds and noted their coordination and thought, these are professionals. In any engagement where the parameters hold, these are professionals who will achieve their objective. The parameters did not hold. Ferreira knew where they would move because he had watched this ground for 60 days and knew where anything moved when it moved north through the district at night. He told Vasquez. Vasquez told Scratch. Scratch went to a position I would not have identified as useful for anything and lay flat and waited. The first element of the core reached the section of ground Ferreira had noted. One of the two lead Erath soldiers stepped into it. The ground did not fail catastrophically, it was not a trap in any conventional sense. The surface layer gave way just enough, just unevenly enough, that the core's lead element lost its careful formation spacing. Two soldiers redirecting their weight on suddenly, unreliable ground instead of advancing in synchrony. A gap of 3 seconds. Maybe 4. It was enough. I will not describe the engagement in detail because it was not elegant and, because the humans would be the first to tell you it was not elegant. It was what Kowalski, afterward, called just getting through it, and what Vasquez called staying alive by arguing with the situation, and what I, in my log, recorded as engagement, core element, northern approach, duration, 47 minutes, outcome, core advance delayed, primary encirclement broken, significant core casualties, 14th breach casualties, 2 injured, 0 fatalities. What I will describe as one specific moment. 40 minutes into the engagement, the core adapted. This was expected, they are designed to adapt. Their second element flanked east in response to the pressure on their first, which was tactically sound, and which Vasquez had not fully anticipated, which I could see in the half-second pause when she registered it, and the calculation ran across her face in a way that I had started to read the way I read sensor data, fast, sequential, outcome pending. The eastern flank would have cut off our retreat to the secondary position. Kowalski was behind me when this happened. He had been managing the communications throughout the engagement. He saw the same thing Vasquez saw, from a different angle. He took out a disruption charge. Not the large assembly, those were gone, spent on the relay. A small one. The kind used for localized structural interference. Kowalski, I said. It's fine, he said. I know what it'll do. He looked at me. His expression was the one he used when he was explaining something that seemed obvious to him and was about to require more work than he wanted to spend on the explanation. The drainage junction on that flank is structurally compromised. I saw it when we came through. If I drop that charge in the right place, it takes about 2 minutes for the flooding to reach the core's eastern approach and about 30 seconds after that for the ground to become non-navigable. And you in the drainage junction when I'll be fine, he said. I'm fast. You have been moving with extreme caution for 3 days because of the disruption charges. I don't have the disruption charges anymore. He was already moving. I want to be precise about this, I am a tactical observer. My role is to observe and record. I do not intervene in operational decisions. I do not have standing to countermand a soldier's judgment in the field. Kowalski, I said. He stopped. The drainage junction is 13 keth spans down the secondary corridor, turns left at the junction marker, second opening on the right. The structural compromise is in the northeast section, the mesh is separated from the concrete, you can see it if you have your light at the right angle. If you place the charge against the separated mesh rather than the concrete, the water pressure will do more of the work and the charge required will be smaller. He looked at me. Second opening on the right, I said. Northeast section. Light at the right angle. He said, you've been memorizing everything. It is my designation. He went. He was back before the drainage junction reached capacity. He was wet and he was grinning and he told his communications relay that it had done a great job and he meant it, or at least he acted as if he did. The core's eastern flank encountered approximately knee-depth moving water in a suddenly compromised drainage channel. They redirected. They adapted again. We were already gone. The secondary position was a collapsed transit hub 3 kethlengths to the west. We reached it with enough time to establish a perimeter and, with everyone present, which was the most important detail and the one Vasquez confirmed before anything else. She went down the line and looked at each person. Not checking for injuries. Looking. Her version of the count, which I had observed enough times to recognize, the assessment that was less about bodies and more about whatever information she gathered from looking directly at someone who had just come through something hard. When she got to me, she paused. "You're logging," she said. "I am always logging." "What does the log say right now?" I looked at the entry. Rotation 17, 5th hour. Reclamation Corps advance disrupted by combined action, 14th breach forward element plus attached personnel. Corps projected to regroup within 4 to 6 hours. 9 rotations to fleet arrival. Current status, secondary position, all personnel present *. We have 9 rotations remaining, I said. I know. She moved on to Ferreira, looked at him for the same direct moment, then, to Vortessen, who had managed the entire engagement on 2 remaining limbs with a composure I found professionally remarkable. She stopped at Vethanara. The young Salvani was, by any clinical assessment, doing well, focused, unhurt, signal station functional. But she was doing the thing I had seen in Devi's patients sometimes, where the body is operational but the processing is 2 or 3 beats behind the present moment, still working through something that has already passed. Vasquez said, "You want more coffee?" Vethanara made a sound that was, unmistakably, a laugh. "No," she said. "I have more." "I know." A pause. "Not yet." Vasquez nodded, as if not yet was a complete and satisfying answer, and moved on. I had observed enough of her interactions to know that she was doing something I did not have a good Kethlon word for. The closest term in our language was velora, which meant something like the acknowledgement of survivorship between those who have survived the same thing, but this was too formal, too transactional. What she was doing was smaller and less official. She was just checking. Not the data. Not the operational status. The people. I wrote, *behavior, individual welfare check, full unit, post-engagement. Duration, 4 minutes. No tactical value. Logged *, then, I deleted no tactical value because I was no longer certain that was accurate. Kowalski's communications relay, it turned out, had sustained damage during the engagement. One of the Arath fragmentation charges that had come through the transit hub's remaining wall had sent shrapnel through the secondary housing, and the relay was now functioning at partial capacity, which meant Coalition Command could hear us but we could not hear them. "Can you fix it?" Vasquez asked. "Yes," said Kowalski, immediately. "In 9 rotations?" A pause. "Yes," he said, with slightly less immediacy. Kowalski. "Yes, with caveats." "What are the caveats?" "I need parts one don't have." Vasquez looked at the relay. She looked around the transit hub, which had been a functional civilian transportation node before the Dominion's arrival and, which still contained, in various states of damage and disuse, the infrastructure of civilian transportation. "How close does the part have to be to spec?" she asked. Kowalski made a face. "Close." Close like same function, different design? Or close like exactly this specific manufactured component? Same function, different design is workable. She pointed to a panel on the far wall. Transit hub communications nodes. They'll be behind there. He looked at the panel. He looked at his relay. He looked at the panel again. "It's not the same system," he said. "It's communications hardware," she said. "You can make it work." He considered this in the way he considered all his equipment negotiations, seriously, respectfully, as if the challenge itself deserved acknowledgement before response. "Give me 6 hours," he said. "You have 4, she said. He went to the panel and introduced himself to it, and I want to note for the record that I watched him do it and felt nothing unusual about it, which was itself a significant data point. Vethanara found me near the edge of the perimeter on the second hour. I was reviewing my logs, not because there was anything new in them but because reviewing logs is something to do when the waiting becomes its own kind of pressure. She said, "Can I ask you something?" "You are asking already," I pointed out. "About them." She meant the humans. Her gesture encompassed, broadly, Vasquez doing a perimeter check, Kowalski talking to a transit node panel, Ferreira standing at a window watching the dark outside with the patient attention of someone who has spent 60 days watching dark outside and found it informative. "What would you like to know?" I said. "How are they like this?" she asked. I looked at her. She was not asking theoretically. She was asking in the way of someone who had experienced something and needed it to resolve into language. "Like what, specifically?" I asked. "We had 38 Salvani in my initial unit," she said. "Trained personnel. We lost 27 in the first rotation. The remaining 11, the decision was made to withdraw and await reinforcement." She paused. "It was the correct decision. I know it was the correct decision. The calculation was it was correct." She looked at Vasquez. "She had 11 people and she went into the sewers," she said. "Yes," I said. "Why?" I had been asking myself this for 6 days. I had accumulated significant observational data. I had revised my probability models multiple times. I had deleted and relogged things I could not classify. "I believe," I said carefully, "that they do not make the same calculation." "But how?" "The numbers are, they can see the numbers." "They can see them," I said. "I have verified this. Vasquez has very good tactical analytical capability." She looked at my projections and she understood them. "Then, why?" "Because," I said, and then stopped, because I was reaching for a concept that I had not fully assembled yet, and I am uncomfortable offering incomplete frameworks as conclusions. Vethanara waited. She had patience, for someone so early in her deployment experience. I suspected the recent rotations had contributed to this. "Because," I said again, "I think the numbers are not the whole calculation." I thought about Vasquez with the photograph. "They add variables that are not in the standard model," I said. "Not irrationally. But the variables are, they are not the kind that appear in the tactical literature. They are not measurable by standard instruments." I paused. "I am still trying to identify what they are." Vethanara looked at me for a long moment. "Are you getting anywhere?" she asked. "Slowly," I said. She nodded, slowly, as if this were a sufficient answer. "Then," she said, "she gave me the coffee first. Before she gave it to anyone else." "I know," I said. "I observed this. She didn't know me." "No. She just gave it to me first. I had nothing to add to this. I had logged it. I had filed it. I had returned to it more times than any other single entry in my 6-day observational record. My log has 47 instances of humans extending resources, attention, or protective behavior to individuals they have no prior relationship with and no tactical incentive to support," I said. 47 observed instances. In 6 days. From a unit of 5 people. Vethanara was quiet for a moment. "What did you file that under?" she asked. "I have not yet determined the correct category," I said. She looked at Vasquez again, now visible at the far end of the perimeter, checking, counting, looking. "Maybe," said Vethanara, quietly, "it's the category." I thought about this for a long time after she went back to her signals station. I thought about it while Kowalski repaired the communications relay by teaching a transit node to speak a language it had not been built for. I thought about it while Ferreira stood at the window and watched the dark with 60 days of knowledge behind his eyes. I thought about it while Scratch said nothing and saw everything and recorded it all in whatever interior log he kept that he had never shown me. I opened my own log. Note, appended, the variable I have been attempting to classify for 6 days may not require classification as a discrete tactical element. It may be structural, woven through all 14th breach behavior as a consistent feature rather than an occasional anomaly. Further observation required. Recommend extended attachment to this unit, *. I paused. Personal note, appended to personal section, the coffee was given to me without request on day 1 of this assignment. I did not record it as significant at the time. In retrospect, I believe it was the first data point. I should have been paying closer attention from the beginning, *. I am paying closer attention now, *. The communications relay, on the 4th hour, came online. Kowalski made a small, satisfied sound and said, "Good job." The relay said nothing. It was a machine. But, for the first time in 6 days, I fully understood why he talked to it. On rotation 18, the Dominion sent a negotiator. I want to be precise about the timing, because it matters. This was 6 hours after the Reclamation Corps' advance had been disrupted, 8 rotations before the Coalition fleet's projected arrival, and approximately 40 minutes after Kowalski had restored full communication with Command. The Corps' adaptation cycle had produced a new calculation, and the new calculation had, apparently, produced a diplomatic impulse. The Dominion's negotiator was a Urath Command Tier officer named Sresvoth. I recognized the designation from the Tactical Intelligence Briefings, a logistics and strategic planning specialist, which was the Dominion's polite way of saying someone who was very good at making problems look like choices. She arrived at the transit hub's eastern entrance under a signal flag that every species in the current conflict recognized as a request to speak before shooting. We did not shoot. This was, I noted, a decision Vasquez made in approximately 3 seconds after confirming the flag's authenticity. 3 seconds is, for the kind of decision it was opening a channel to a Dominion officer whose corps had just spent the better part of a rotation trying to eliminate us, a remarkably short deliberation cycle. "You're sure?" said Scratch, from his window position. "She's Command Tier," said Vasquez. "She's not here because the corps is winning." Scratch considered this. "Still," he said. "Yeah," said Vasquez. "Still." She looked at me. "Sev, you've dealt with Dominion negotiation protocols?" "Professionally," I said. "3 times. Is there anything I need to know?" I thought about what I knew about Irath negotiation protocols. There was quite a lot to know, most of it procedural, some of it potentially relevant. I thought about how to compress this into something useful in a time window that was clearly limited. "They respect directness," I said. "They do not respect what they call Veldar, which roughly means performative weakness, asking for something while pretending you are not asking for it. If you want something, state it. If you will not yield on something, state that too." I paused. And they do not expect to be surprised by their counterpart. They come prepared for scenarios they have modeled. If you do something outside those scenarios, they find it destabilizing. Vasquez nodded. She looked at the entrance. "Okay," she said. That was all she said. She went to meet the negotiator. I observed from a position that allowed me to see both the human and the Irath officer without being directly in their sightlines, which is the correct position for a tactical observer and which I chose without thinking about it, which is perhaps the most honest thing I can say about what 6 days with the 14th breach had done to my professional instincts. I was observing like someone who cared about the outcome. Sresvoth was tall, for a Irath. Command Tier markings on her carapace, the deep blue-gray inlay that the Dominion used to denote strategic rank. She moved with the precision of someone who had grown accustomed to being the most prepared entity in any given space. Her secondary visual organs tracked the transit hub's layout in the first 4 seconds, cataloging exits, personnel positions, potential threats, exactly as tactical training produced. She was also, I noticed, watching Vasquez the same way I watched Vasquez. Which is to say, carefully, and with the slightly unsettled quality of someone whose calibration equipment is giving inconsistent readings. Vasquez stopped at a distance that was slightly closer than standard negotiation protocol called for. Close enough to convey that she was not retreating into formality. Close enough to be, by Irath measurement conventions, slightly aggressive without being actually aggressive. Whether she knew this was intentional or instinctive, I could not determine. "You know who we are," said Vasquez. "Not a question." 14th breach, forward element, said Sresvoth, in accented coalition standard. 7 surviving members of your unit plus 4 attached personnel. 1 Keflon observer. 1 Salvani signals specialist. You destroyed our northern relay and disrupted a reclamation corps advance with 11 personnel. This is unexpected. Okay, said Vasquez. Sresvoth waited, clearly, for something more. Vasquez offered nothing more. I am authorized to offer terms, said the Dominion officer. Tell me the terms. Cessation of resistance. Surrender of coalition communications assets. In exchange, full prisoner rights under the compact, released to coalition custody upon conflict resolution. Upon conflict resolution, said Vasquez. Yes. That means when you win. A pause. It means upon the resolution of current hostilities, said Sresvoth. Vasquez looked at her. She was doing the thing I had started to call her real face, the underface, the one without the operational efficiency layer. You're here because 8 rotations is too long for the Corps to complete the encirclement before the fleet arrives, she said. You can't guarantee control of the northern corridor, which means you can't guarantee the landing zones are denied. So you need us to stop. She tilted her head slightly. That's why you're here. Sresvoth was quiet for a moment. Something in her carapace coloration shifted, a very slight deepening in the blue-gray markings, which, in Erath physiological terms, indicated what I would classify as the involuntary stress response of someone whose modeled scenarios have just been bypassed. I am offering you a reasonable, I know it's reasonable, said Vasquez. It is a very reasonable offer. We're 11 people and you're 3 companies. She looked at the flag. My answer is no. Another silence. You will not survive 8 more rotations, said Sresvoth. Maybe, said Vasquez. But, the relay is down and, the Corps is behind schedule and, you're standing here instead of fighting, which means the math is already different than you planned. She looked at the Dominion officer with an expression that was not unkind. We don't need to survive. We just need to be a problem for 8 more rotations. Sresvoth looked at her for a long moment. This is not rational, she said. I know, said Vasquez, and she almost smiled. It never is. I have reviewed my log from the next 6 minutes and I want to note that Sresvoth spent most of them asking variations of the same question in different phrasings, which is something Erath strategic planners do when they have encountered a variable they cannot incorporate into their model. They ask the question differently, hoping a different angle will produce a different answer, because the answer they have received does not fit the available space in the architecture they have built. The different phrasings did not produce a different answer. Vasquez said no in approximately 7 different ways, none of them rude, most of them almost gentle, as if she understood that the person asking had not expected to need to hear it this many times and was, in some way Vasquez found neither amusing nor frustrating, to be extended a certain patience. Near the end, Sresvoth said, What do you want? There must be something you want. And, Vasquez said, I want the fleet to land. That is a military objective, not a negotiating position. I know. What do you want for yourself? Vasquez thought about this in what appeared to be genuine consideration of a genuine question. For my people to get through the next 8 rotations, she said. That is also, yeah, said Vasquez. It's what I want. Sresvoth looked at her the way I look at data that has returned an impossible output. The look of someone running the calculation again, not because they expect a different result, but because the result they have is the wrong shape for the space it is supposed to fill. She left under the signal flag. Vasquez watched her go. Then, she turned around and looked at me. Log it, she said. I already did, I said. She almost smiled again. This time it completed. I will tell you what happened in rotations 18 through 25 and the way it actually happened, which is to say, not cleanly. It happened in sections, in the way that hard things always happen, with long stretches of managed tension and short explosions of total chaos, with small victories that mattered and significant setbacks that had to be absorbed and redirected, with nights that seemed too long and hours that seemed too short and a great deal of Kowalski talking to equipment in a voice that I had stopped finding strange and started finding steadying, which was its own category of adjustment. The core came twice more. They adapted, as they were designed to do. Ferreira's knowledge of the ground was finite each time they came. They incorporated what had failed before and tried something new. This was correct doctrine. It reduced our advantage incrementally. On rotation 20, Park's shoulder became an emergency again. Debbie handled it in a supply situation that, by any clinical standard, was inadequate. She used what she had. She improvised. Afterward, she sat for a while longer than her usual post-procedure reset period, and Vasquez sat next to her, not touching, not speaking, just present, which was something I had seen humans do for each other and which I had initially classified as tactical inefficiency. I had long since reclassified it. Vortessen, the Kethlon engineer with 2 remaining limbs, built 3 different structural modifications to our position over the course of 7 rotations using materials that were not intended for structural modification. I want to record this specifically because he did it methodically, without being asked, because he had assessed that these modifications were needed and he had the relevant expertise, and so he simply did them. When I asked him why, he said, because someone should, and I thought this was possibly the sentence of the entire operation that would stay with me longest. On rotation 23, with 2 rotations remaining, Scratch spoke. He had been speaking throughout, tactical updates, position confirmations, the minimal necessary communication of someone who had calibrated exactly how much needed to be said and committed to saying nothing above that threshold. But, on rotation 23, in the quiet between a core probe and its inevitable follow-up, he said, Sev. I looked up from my log. Yes? He looked at me in the way he looked at distant things through his scope, measuring, assessing, not unkind. What are you going to put in the final report? He asked. I looked at my log. I looked at 50-some-odd days of entries. I looked at 47 instances of humans extending resources to strangers without tactical incentive, at 1 photograph and 1 cup of coffee given first, at negotiating with equipment and knowing ground by dropping things on it, at a calculation that consistently refused to be made and a word I kept reaching for in my own language that kept coming back inadequate. I don't know yet, I said. He nodded, as if this were a completely acceptable answer, which I appreciated, because it was honest. Good, he said. Means you were paying attention. He raised the scope. I went back to the log. The fleet arrived at the beginning of rotation 26. This is not a dramatic observation. It arrived when it was scheduled to arrive. The 12-rotation window held. The landing zones were open because the Northern Artillery Network had been dark since rotation 14, and the Corps' encirclement had been disrupted enough times that they could not guarantee controlled fields of fire in the landing corridor, and a Dominion negotiator had stood in a ruined transit hub and asked a human what she wanted and heard an answer that did not fit the available space. I was on the roof of the transit hub when the fleet broke into the upper atmosphere. My visual range does not extend to unaided naked observation of orbital entry, but I have excellent thermal sensing, and the heat bloom of a coalition fleet entering controlled descent is a distinctive signature, and I stood on a damaged roof on a contested world and felt 11 distinct thermal signatures beginning their descent and thought we were a problem for 8 more rotations. Vasquez was next to me. She had come up to the roof without explanation, and I had followed her, because following Vasquez had, over 26 rotations, become something I apparently did without thinking about it. We stood in the morning. Verith9's sun was a red-yellow, smaller than standard, and the mornings had a quality of muted bronze light that I had logged in my sensory record because I am thorough, and watched the thermal signatures descend. 11 vessels, I said, because I was logging even then. Yeah. The flagship is the Coral Reach. Command Class. Admiral Seveth Yen. I know her, said Vasquez. She will want a full debrief. She's going to have to wait until I've slept. I looked at her. She was watching the sky with an expression that was different from the operational ones, different from the underface, different from the almost smiles. Something more settled. Not happiness exactly, more specific than that. More tired. The expression of someone who has held something for a long time and is beginning to understand that they can put it down. You said you wanted the fleet to land, I said. Yeah. It landed. Yeah. A pause. It did. The bronze light moved across the transit hub's rooftop. From below, I could hear Kowalski saying something to the communication system, and Devi laughing at something Park said, and Bethanera's signal station clicking steadily through its connection protocols, and Ferreira's absolute silence from the window, which was its own kind of present. In my report, I said. She glanced at me. I have written 47 instances of behavior I initially classified as tactical anomalies, I said. Extensions of resources, protective behavior, irrational loyalty, unprompted care for individuals with no prior relationship and no transactional relevance. She was very still. I have been trying to find the right category for them, I said. For most of the assignment. I have gone through the standard taxonomies. None of them fit. What did you decide? She asked. I have not decided, I said. I am still observing. I paused. But, I have a working hypothesis. She waited. The thermal signatures of 11 ships continued their controlled descent. I think, I said carefully, that the variable I have been trying to classify is not a tactical variable. I think it is a load-bearing element of how your species has constructed its decision architecture. The one that is not in the standard model. I looked at the sky. I think you include other people in the calculation. Not as assets or liabilities. As reasons. Vasquez said nothing for a moment. You make the math bigger, I said. So that the outcome you're calculating is not just your own survival. It's theirs. And, when the math is that big, the acceptable loss threshold is. I stopped. I don't have the right Keflon word for what it becomes. Yeah, she said. We don't really either. She looked at the descending fleet. We just do it, she said. We don't think about why. I know, I said. That is the part one find most. I looked for the word. I found the wrong one. I found the right one. Most. She turned to look at me. Most what? She asked. Most, I said. She laughed. A real one. Brief and, not performance and, real. Okay, she said. The debrief with Admiral Seveth Yen took 6 hours and covered most of what I have recorded here in considerably less colorful language. The Admiral was, as I had expected, focused on tactical outcomes, the relay, the core disruptions, the strategic value of a window held for 12 rotations against significant force disparity. She asked me, near the end of the debrief, for my overall assessment of the 14th breach forward element. I thought about the answer for a moment. Combat effective, I said. The Admiral waited, in the way of someone who expected more from a senior observer's assessment. Highly adaptive under resource constraints, I added. Demonstrated consistent maintenance of unit cohesion under extended high-pressure operation. Tactical improvisation capability in excess of standard projections. I paused. Individual personnel demonstrated unusual capability for maintaining operational effectiveness through mutual support structures. Mutual support structures, said the Admiral. Yes. She made a note. Is that a euphemism for something in your report? She asked. It is an incomplete description of something in my report, I said. The complete description requires a category I have not yet fully defined. She looked at me with the particular expression of senior officers being told by observers that things are more complex than they wanted them to be. Will the full report be ready on standard schedule? Yes, I said. Will it recommend continued integration of human combat units with coalition operations? I thought about this for exactly as long as I needed to think about it. Yes, I said. She made another note. The debrief concluded. I did not return to my standard observer billet that night. I sat in the transit hub, which was no longer technically a secured perimeter but which still smelled extraordinarily bad and which still had Kowalski's repairs on the communications relay and Ferreira's trace markings on the windowsill where he had rested his scope for 26 rotations, and I worked on the report. Or rather, I worked on the part of the report that was not the official report. The personal section, the observational appendix, the log entries that would be archived but not cited in the formal assessment. The part that was mine. I wrote about Velsharath, the rational acceptance of a correct loss, and how I had carried it. I wrote about 47 instances. I wrote about a photograph and a cup of coffee given first, and about the difference between assets and reasons. I wrote about a drainage channel and an Erath negotiator who had asked the wrong question, or the right question and received the truthful answer, and about a man who spent 60 days alone and documented unstable ground by dropping things on it because he needed to know. I wrote about calculation. About the math being bigger. I do not know if what I wrote is correct. I am a tactical observer. I observe and record and assess, and my assessments are, most of the time, well supported and accurate. I filed projections on the 14th breach and they were wrong, and I have been wrong before, but not quite in this way, not in the way where the wrongness feels less like a failure of analysis and more like evidence that I was analyzing the wrong thing entirely. The personal section does not end with a conclusion, because I have not reached one. It ends with a recommendation for extended attachment to the 14th breach forward element, pending reconstruction of the unit following current engagement losses. And it ends with one note that I have debated including and have decided to include because I am thorough, and because thoroughness, I have learned, includes the things that are hard to categorize alongside the things that are easy. The note says, on rotation 14, in a drainage channel that smelled extremely bad on a world that should have already been lost, the unit medic told me this was a good day. I filed this under anomalous behavior. I am revising this classification. I believe it was an accurate assessment. I believe I now understand what criteria she was using. I am still learning to use them myself, but I am working on it. Some things take time. The humans seem to know this. They never seem to mind. Vasquez found me in the transit hub near the end of my writing. She did not announce herself. She came in, looked at me with the log open and my recording apparatus running, and came over and sat against the wall the way humans sit when they are not sitting for any particular reason, just choosing to be somewhere. I kept writing. She did not ask what I was writing. After a while she said, "What are your reassignment prospects?" "Good," I said. "My performance record is strong." "Would you get to pick the assignment?" "With sufficient justification, yes." A pause. "We're getting rebuilt. New personnel, new attached element. Going back out in 6 rotations." "I know," I said. "You'd be bored assigned anywhere else," she said. Probably, I agreed. "The coffee is terrible," she said. "Just so you know. I know you haven't tried it yet, but it's terrible. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." "I am aware of this from extensive observation," I said. "Observation's different from experience," she said. I looked at her. She looked at me. "You're logging," she said. "I am always logging." "Log this," she said, and handed me a container. I held it. It was warm. It smelled like something that had accepted its fate. I logged, rotation 26, morning. Human extended beverage coffee, standard issue, to Kethlan Observer without request. This is the second such instance recorded. Previous instance was logged as anomalous, I paused. I deleted anomalous. I drank the coffee. It tasted like rust and optimism, which was exactly what she had said it would taste like, and, which I want to note I found, despite all prediction, completely appropriate. The fleet was outside. The Northern Line was in the process of changing hands in a way that would be finalized in the reports I would file tomorrow and, the week after and, the cycle after that. Verith 9 was going to make it. I sat in the transit hub that smelled like a sewer and drank the worst beverage I have ever been offered by a member of any species. I thought about Velsharath. About rational acceptance. About the math of dying, and how every species I had ever encountered had found their way to it sooner or later. I thought about Vasquez asking whether it was possible. Not asking about casualties. I opened a new entry. Working theory, revision 3, the variable is not irrational. The variable is that they are calculating something I was not measuring. Not just survival. Not just the mission. Something larger, and more complicated, and not fully translatable into any framework. I arrived here with asterisk. I do not yet have the word for it in my language asterisk. I am starting to suspect the correct response is not to find the word asterisk. The correct response is to stay until I don't need one asterisk. I closed the log. Outside, Kowalski was already talking to the reconstruction equipment, introducing himself, asking how it was doing, telling it he was glad they were going to be working together. I heard it. I did not find it strange. That was how I knew I had been changed.